My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
The origins of the idea for this little mini two-part series, which I'll explain in a bit, kinda starts with me watching the Drumeo video of the extremely talented metal/prog drummer Mike Portnoy of Dream Theater being challenged to learn Tool's Pneuma off their latest album. Even as a non-drummer, watching him try to pick that puzzle apart and eventually yelling at the camera, telling Tool drummer Danny Carey to lose his number when it was suggested that he might fill in for Danny one day was a highly entertaining experience, which then led to a number of videos being suggested of me at just normal drummers watching Danny Carey play that same song in concert and enjoying people just explaining why what he's doing is so insane. All of which led to me listening to my Tool albums again, which in turn made me think it would be cool to do a Sound Stories episode on them. Now, my initial inclination was to do an episode about my favorite Tool album, Lateralus. I have no idea how popular or not that opinion is, but I do not care. Because it's an opinion, it's purely subjective. Just because it's my favorite album does not mean it has to be anyone else's. The problem was, with as notoriously secretive as the band has been historically, I wasn't completely sure if I could find enough information. Indeed, even as I started my research, I still wasn't 100% sure if I was going to have enough. It was then as I got started that I realized that the story of Lateralus is almost inescapably also tied to the story of AEnima and the first album by Maynard's side project A Perfect Circle. As it was with AEnima that bass player Justin Chancellor joined the band, whose influence is really strongly felt on Lateralus. Meanwhile, delays in writing Lateralus, partially due to a lawsuit with their label, led to the creation of Maynard's side project A Perfect Circle. So instead of trying to separate these stories, which despite how good each of these albums are, may not have enough info to support their own episodes, I decided to combine them into a singular narrative that would then be split into 2 episodes, with this first one focusing on the birth of Tool and eventually the creation of AEnima, and the next episode focusing on A Perfect Circle's debut album Merde Noms and Tool's Lateralus. To gather together all the bits and pieces that I needed to assemble this story, I used a wide array of sources, including articles by writers like George Garner, John Waterhorn, Eleanor Goodman, Sarah Jensen, Maynard James Keenan, John McKelly, Kurt Loder, Aaron Burgess, Ryan Reed, Daniel J. Kushner, Liberty Dunworth, Jordan Blum, Andrew McMillan, Phil Freeman, Dan Oliva, Andy Green, Brad Keefe, James Roberts, Sam Law, B.J. Lisco, Chris Norris, Hank Steamer, Brad Engel, Graham Hartman, as well as interviews by Rick Beto and John Martin on their respective YouTube channels, links to all of which will be available on this podcast Ko-fi and Twitter pages. And with all that being said, let's begin. The origins of Tool actually in many ways can be traced back to the self-described worst band in the world, Green Jello, which, due to a lawsuit by the manufacturers of Jello, is now spelled Green Jelly, with umlauts over the Y. Umlauts that, according to the madman behind the band, makes it so it's pronounced Green Jello. Now, the name of this particular madman is Bill Manspeaker, who had been born and raised in Buffalo, New York before moving out to Hollywood. Bill, you see, had fallen in love with punk rock and was inspired to form a band of his own. However, when said band first attempted to play a Ramones song, they butchered it badly, which I would think is easier said than done, but they somehow managed it. Bill responded to this disaster by suggesting that they should just start writing their own music, because that way, no one would be able to tell if they were playing it wrong. He also wanted to embrace the idea of being the worst band in the world, which led to their name Green Jello, as that was the worst flavor. He leaned into it so much that their first song consisted of getting the audience to chant Green Jello sucks. Green Jello then, especially as the years went on, became less of a traditional band and more of a kind of art collective that was as much about the music as it was about being ridiculous and over the top as possible. It became kind of performance art, which incorporated a bunch of weird and off-the-wall goofy costumes, masks, and puppets. There was a real theater troupe kind of aspect to Green Jello, which worked with their open door policy, as at the time, Bill had some 50 musicians that he could pull from to put a performance together. According to Bill himself, quote, "I had a whole scene going on there. At 3 o'clock in the morning there would be 80 people at my house, jamming, creating costumes, and being creative. Anybody that needed a place to stay could stay, so there were always 10 or 20 people living in the house, and we just fed off of each other and played. I didn't care if I had 20 guitar players, 14 bass players, and 7 drummers all jamming." Among those taking part in this whole Green Jello scene was drummer Danny Carey, who had moved to LA from Kansas. He had joined a band called Carmageddon, with a K, whose guitarist Steven Sheener also played with Green Jello, so it was through Steven that Danny got involved. Danny's first real love musically was Led Zeppelin, discovering them round about the same time he started playing drums, so he was heavily inspired by John Bonham and all the things he was doing. From there, Danny started getting into more prog stuff like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, and Genesis. He was also heavily inspired by Neil Peart of Rush. Additionally, Danny would also be introduced to jazz fusion through his drum teacher, and he had even played with a jazz big band for a time, all of which would influence his style and technique. Meanwhile, another future member of Tool was also coming into Bill Manspeaker's orbit. You see, guitarist Adam Jones's girlfriend worked in the same office as Bill's girlfriend. The two young women got to talking, and eventually their conversation turned to the weird costumes and props that Danny used with his band. At which point Adam's girlfriend mentioned how her boyfriend worked in costumes and effects. It was then through their girlfriends and this connection that the two were introduced. Now, while Adam was working in the film industry and had even worked on such major projects as Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, he wasn't from LA. Instead, he had originally hailed from Park Ridge, Illinois. It was there where he first picked up the guitar after finding an old acoustic in his family's house. Wherever this guitar came from, it was enough to spark his interest, and by high school, Adam had formed a band called the Electric Sheep with fellow guitarist and classmate Tom Morello. Adam was very inspired by the likes of Adrian Belew, Trey Gunn, and Robert Fripp of King Crimson. Indeed, it was through King Crimson that Adam says he first woke up to music. He also credits the likes of Andy Gill of the Gang of Four for helping him to shake off his initial classic rock influences, Paul Leary of the Butthole Surfers for demonstrating how to be innovative and unafraid of breaking the rules of music theory, and even Buzz Osborne of the Melvins for just the brutality of his playing. While his former high school bandmate would also eventually end up in LA after detouring to Harvard, Adam's education focused on getting into the film industry, eventually landing him a gig with Stan Winston Studios. It was then round about the same time that Adam was first getting to know Bill Manspeaker and helping out with the costumes for Green Jello that he first started to get to know another future member of Tool. You see, much like how his girlfriend had introduced Adam to Bill, another of Adam's friends was dating a guy who may or may not have been going by Maynard at the time, and it was through this connection that the two first met and got to talking about art, movies, and music. Now, the man who would become famous as Maynard James Keenan had been born James Herbert Keenan. James/Maynard then grew up in Ohio before eventually joining the Army. A decision that he jokes was inspired by the Bill Murray movie Stripes, but also admits it was because he needed money to attend art school. He also believed at the time that actual armed conflicts were a thing of the past, and the world had found a peaceful groove of sorts. Now, he was wrong, but even without getting involved in one of our eventual forever wars, Maynard almost immediately realized that he had made a wrong decision. At the same time, his experience in the Army wasn't all bad. As a former leader of his high school cross-country team, the discipline, the connection with the members of his squad, the warrior mentality, and just the challenge of it was appealing to him. After getting out of the Army, he then went to art school in Michigan, which is where he first really started adopting the Maynard moniker to at least some extent, a name that he had first used for the small, wiry character he used to draw to illustrate the poems he wrote in high school. After art school, Maynard found himself working designing displays and the like for pet stores in Cambridge, Massachusetts. However, he soon found that he couldn't take the cold weather anymore, and so he headed off for LA. There he got work doing interior designs for stores and working on sets for music videos and the like. It's here that we pick back up our main narrative, as Maynard and Adam started to bond over art, movies, and music. At some point along the way, then, Maynard shared with his new friend a tape his art school band, Children of the Anachronistic Dynasty, had made. Cassettes which apparently originally came with a manifesto that questioned the values of corporate middle-class America. As for the music, it was rough, but it contained a very early version of Sober, and it was clear that Maynard could actually sing. Indeed, his taste in music was a bit unique from the rest of the band, as he was inspired by the likes of Stevie Wonder, Susie Sue of Susie and the Banshees, and singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell. Maynard then had a special appreciation for melody. As for Adam, he was so impressed by his new friend's singing abilities, he suggested they start a band. In doing so, he wasn't looking to turn it into a career. He already had one of those. He really just wanted to do music as a hobby. Yet first interested as Adam seemed to be in this potential project, Maynard was reluctant. So, looking to inspire Maynard into doing something musically, Adam one day brought his new friend over to Bill Mann's Speaker's Loft, which was also the home base of Green Jello, a project that really kinda spoke to Maynard. As for him, it was, quote, very inspiring to see them just enjoying this, and they were working at record stores and working at various jobs. This was their ambition. They wanted this. There was no, well, we're going to make it big and go somewhere else with this. It was more about, this is what we want to do in this room right now. What do we have to do during our day that will make it possible for us to all get together and do this at night? They were just loving what they were doing. It wasn't a stepping stone to another thing. This was life. This was it. So that was really inspiring for me. So while Maynard was still hesitant to do something serious with Adam, he would start jamming with the silly offbeat Green Jello squad. In fact, he even ultimately moved in with them, as he seemed to have gone through a real rough patch during this time, as over the span of a couple months, he got fired, lost his apartment, had his car repossessed, his girlfriend left him, and his dog was run over. Which is all to say he needed help, and Bill was more than happy to lend a hand. According to Bill, though, he just made sure to alert any visitors that his roommate, Jim, as he apparently still knew him, was a little grumpy, always making sure to add that, quote, he doesn't mean any harm, he's a good guy. If he says something rude or weird, just ignore it, he's a good person. Then, somewhere along the way, according to Bill's recollection, Jim cut his hair and started going by Maynard full-time. It was also around about this time that Maynard grew frustrated with working on music sets for less than $50 a day. It was becoming more and more apparent that he needed a different outlet for his creativity. Plus, with everything else that had happened in his life, he really needed an outlet with which to vent. It was with this in mind that Maynard started growing more and more intrigued by Adam's proposal to start a band. In doing so, though, he didn't want to be like the vast majority of bands that he saw playing in the clubs in and around LA. Bands that, in his opinion, that were rather than making music that they found truly interesting and were passionate about, were instead more than anything, just taking cues from A&R guys, label scouts, and various marketing types. As Maynard started jamming with Adam, then he quickly recognized that not only was a guitarist dedicated to his craft, but he was exactly the kind of guitarist he could work with. You see, Maynard didn't need a flashy guitar player. He needed someone who could create a structure that played off the emotions that he was looking to express through his lyrics, and Adam's reserved yet creative playing fit his needs perfectly. As they started playing together, Adam pulled in another friend and co-worker of his, a bass player who just recently moved to LA from Seattle, Paul Diamore. Paul had some of that grunge DNA in his playing, and he also approached the bass more like it was a guitar than a traditional bassist would, which again might not have worked in a different setting, but again fit in with Adam's more reserved approach. At this point, their little fledgling group had a guitarist, a singer, and a bass player. All they needed now then was a drummer, but that was apparently easier said than done in LA in those days. Maynard, though, thought he knew the perfect guy, as among the myriad of people who work with Green Jello was the aforementioned drummer Danny Carey. Danny, though, was already playing with a couple of other bands, and he wasn't really interested in getting involved in another. He was, though, willing to allow them to rent out a room in his loft as they tried to get their project off the ground. So they held auditions and invited any number of guys to come over and play with them. Reportedly, among the drummers they were looking at was the former drummer of the band Autograph. However, Autograph's former drummer, like so many of the others, flaked and didn't show up. For his part, Danny couldn't help but notice when Maynard, Adam, and Paul were once again Sand's drummer. So, since they were already in his loft where he had his drum set up, he agreed to play with them. Just this one time. He wanted to make that very clear. He was only going to sit in on this one session. By the end of it, though, it was Danny who was suggesting they get together and do it again. He had found the odd time signatures that the others were utilizing really interesting and exciting. It had been fun, and so they got together again. And soon he was suggesting, hey, let's jam a couple times a week, and they never really stopped. In fact, Tool still uses that same loft to this day to gather and write their music. As the group started putting a collection of songs together, they also started booking shows around town, the first of which happened in Bill Manspeaker's loft, which was especially notable because also in attendance that night was Kevin Coogan, who worked for Zoo Records. Kevin was there because Green Jello, for all their weird non-traditional rock band nature, had just gotten a deal with the label, doing so without the execs ever actually hearing the band. Indeed, Bill wasn't even planning on releasing a traditional album but a series of music videos. An insane plan that still somehow managed to spawn a hit single with Three Little Pigs and his claymation video that earned the group a Grammy nomination. A track in which Maynard notably provided vocals for the Little Pigs, and I believe Danny also provided the drums as well. All of that aside, on the night of Tool's first ever performance, Kevin Coogan of Zoo Records was completely blown away by the fledgling group. So blown away, in fact, that he couldn't stop talking about them when he went into work at the label. Hearing Kevin's effusive praise, an A&R guy, basically the label's scouting and development department, decided he would go and check the group out for himself when they played at a place called Club Lingerie a couple of weeks later. Now, on the day in question, by the time Tool got started, it was late and Matt Marshall, the A&R guy, was very tired. Plus, there were like maybe 10 other people in the venue. Yet despite all that, Matt was so impressed that he asked if Kevin could get a demo of the group from Bill. Partially this was because he wanted to make sure that his first impression wasn't the result of just being really tired. When he got the tape though, Matt just kept playing it over and over again for a few days, just completely blown away by what he was hearing. This band was just so good and so unique, especially at a time when everyone was trying to mimic Nirvana's success. Indeed, Maynard would credit the Seattle band and the fact they were having on the music industry for effectively setting the stage for Tool's success, stating, quote, "We owed a lot to Nirvana. Nirvana opened the door for most music guys around town who were chasing their tails trying to find the next big thing. They hear us and we don't sound like most of the other stuff going on, so they don't really get it, but they knew that it was different." Basically, while pretty much everyone else was rushing around looking to copy the new popular thing, this group of what Maynard would describe as, quote, "pretty pissed off, relatively talented, comparatively, musicians, only stood out all the more by offering something different and compelling. And so it was after only playing 7 gigs that Tool was signed to Zoo Entertainment. Now, this early version of Tool was obviously not the band they would later become. While still being a metal band of some kind or another, Tool are often described as having this kind of higher-minded, almost spiritual aspect to their music. Early Tool, though, was very much driven by emotion, primarily anger. Indeed, according to Maynard, quote, "My musical approach came from a lot of the frustration of living in LA. I was busting ass trying to survive. Rent was high and there was a lot of weird hypocrisy in this dog and pony show that happens within the film and music industries, which I found very awkward. A lot of the original pieces were inspired by that kind of energy. The music was emotionally driven and reactionary. It was all about emoting and releasing that primal scream." Early Tool then had a particularly aggressive edge. In fact, even though they had most of Undertow already written by the time they went to record their first EP, Opiate, the members of Tool made the conscious choice to put all of their most aggressive in-your-face songs on Opiate, thinking that's what they needed to do to get the public's attention. Oddly enough, though, the track that got the most response, Opiate, was the least aggressive and in-your-face song on the entire EP. When they moved on to Undertow, Tool began to let the music breathe a little more, and in doing so added a bit more atmosphere to their songs. As they did, they also gave Maynard the space in which to express more, and even express different emotions than just anger and frustration. Although, overall, I would still characterize Undertow as very much still being primarily focused on those emotions. Now, Undertow would not prove to be an immediate hit, yet between their time taking part in Lollapalooza and the unique nature of the video for Sober, the band started grabbing people's attention, and in doing so, they started finding a larger and larger audience. Indeed, over the course of the Lollapalooza tour, they went from playing on the second stage to the main stage, where they came to be known as one of the festival's standout performers. It wasn't all good news though, as the excessive touring and the close quarters it forced the 4 members of the band into for extended periods took a toll on them and on their relationships. By the end of the tour then, everyone kind of needed space, and with bassist Paul D'Amore, a more permanent solution was needed due to creative and personal differences. Now, according to Maynard, they remain friends, but within the specific dynamic of being in a band together, things just weren't working. From the limited comments made by the others in the band concerning D'Amour's departure, it seems that Paul was set on doing things his way, and he expected the others to more or less follow his lead. It also sounds like he was kind of into the idea of going into a more traditional rock direction than what the others were interested in doing. Additionally, Maynard would attribute some of Paul's issues with the bassist having what he called indie guilt, meaning he was uncomfortable with the level of success the band was experiencing, and so he just could not allow himself to enjoy it. These complicated emotions about the concept of selling out and just the frustration in response to such accusations would be investigated further on the track Hooker with a Penis, a track from their upcoming album that, as a result of the anger and frustration baked into it, most sounds like it could have come off of Undertow. Before we get to that point, however, after parting ways with their original bassist as the band chose to put what was essentially a firing, they needed to find a replacement. Which means we now have to shift our focus away from LA to a little island across the Atlantic Ocean that has caused so much trouble historically, England. We do so because this was the home of bassist Justin Chancellor. Now, Justin had been a huge Tool fan from early on. This was due to the fact that his brother was friends with Matt Marshall, the A&R guy who had spearheaded the band getting signed. It was then as a result of this friendship that the brothers were able to get a copy of Tool's first demo in 1991, a demo that was pretty rare in Europe in those days. Justin was completely blown away by this obscure band from LA, and he fell in love immediately. The two brothers would even take the opportunity to go see the band when they played in CBGB's in New York, during which time, since they knew Matt and Marshall, they were introduced to the band and subsequently became friends. Justin's band Peaches would even open up for Tool during a stretch of their European tour. As such, when the members of Tool made the decision to fire Paul, Adam Jones put in a call to the UK, informing Justin of their situation and letting the bass player know they wanted to audition him. Now, Justin's first reaction to this news was surprisingly no. He just could not process what was happening and was just too intimidated by even the thought of doing it. Justin's brother, upon hearing of the situation, though, would manage to talk him into it, at which point Justin had to call Adam back to see if they were fine with him changing his mind and taking the audition. Now, Tool were obviously more than happy to have Justin audition for them, and so they sent him demos of Push It, Anima, and Eulogy, songs they had already begun writing at this point. His band Peaches, on the other hand, didn't take the news so well, and so when he told them about this opportunity, they fired him on the spot. This was a pretty tumultuous time for Justin then, as there was no guarantee he was going to land the gig with Tool, seeing as how they were also auditioning the likes of Scott Reeder, who had replaced Nick Oliveri in Caius, and Frank Kavanagh of Filter. For the members of Tool, though, the thing that would separate Justin from the others was when, after playing through the songs they had sent him to work on, they went into a free-form jam session. Now, they did this with all the bass players they were auditioning, but it was here in this particular setting that they realized that Justin was the right guy for the job. Yet, even though he got the gig, this still seems like it was a rough time for Justin, as in addition to moving to a new country where he didn't really know anyone, only taking with him his bass and his clothes, he also seems to have experienced a bit of imposter syndrome, as he said there was quite a long time where he didn't feel confident with the stuff he was coming up with. He was just so intimidated by Tool and its legacy that even when the other guys were telling him that his stuff was good, he had trouble believing them. He was, after all, coming into a situation where the band was already established and successful. Indeed, they had already begun work writing their latest album when he was brought in. As such, Justin was very conscious about not wanting to mess things up or step on anyone's proverbial toes. So, while he would and seems to have been very much encouraged to introduce ideas, I would say he didn't have as much of an impact on this particular album, Anima, as he would have on their subsequent releases. Speaking of Anima, which is how the band has pronounced it, it is a combination of two words, anima, spelled without an E, and anima. Now, I don't think I actually have to explain the concept of an enema to you, but anima, on the other hand, seems to have two definitions. It's either a reference to the Jungian concept of the feminine qualities that lie in the male unconscious, or simply another word for the soul. The specific combination of anima and anima then potentially could represent the idea of cleaning out all the negative shit out of one's soul, which seems fitting as it is an album all about change, both in terms of its creation and its themes. 46 and 2, for example, focuses on change and metamorphosis, which is quite fitting as the main riff for this song was penned by Justin Chancellor during the period after he got fired by his old band and before he got the gig with Tool. Indeed, at the time when he was coming up with this riff, Justin pretty much just assumed he wasn't going to be picked to join Tool. So in his mind, his future was nothing but possibilities and change. As such, he was just writing music for some unknown potential future project. In addition to the idea of change, 46 and 2 is also a song that very much embodies the overall theme of the album, as implied by its title of clearing the negativity out of you so you can move on. A theme that you can also see in the 9th track of the album, Jimmy, which is also possibly the first reference we see in Tool's music to Keenan's mother Judith Marie's brain aneurysm that happened when he was 11. This cerebral hemorrhage left her paralyzed, and left young Maynard, who was Jimmy at the time, crushed and reeling. The song then is about Maynard returning home as an adult and trying to come to terms and heal from that traumatic experience he had as Jimmy. Now there's a lot more openness to the music in this song and in others on this album than what was on Tool's previous releases, which in many ways comes down to Adam Jones's approach to guitar playing and to Tool. It was, after all, this kind of reserved approach that attracted Maynard to working with him in the first place. As such, I don't feel that the vast majority of his guitar riffs are all that technically challenging in and of themselves, which is why I would argue that in some ways Tool is deceptively complex. The complexity doesn't come so much from the difficulty of the riff, but with the odd and sometimes shifting time signatures they like to play around with. It's as a result of this that while a riff may sound and even be easy to play, there can be moments when the rhythm shifts and it's not quite what you were expecting, or when playing, it doesn't come as naturally because you're not used to thinking/playing in that time signature. Adam's skill then comes from being able to navigate these shifts and knowing when and when not to add his little touches to add texture to the song. Plus, it would be a mistake to judge Tool just by their guitar parts, as arguably it's not a traditional guitar-driven band. Indeed, oftentimes, especially from AEnima on, Jones is more focused on adding atmospheric touches to songs and playing traditional riffs. The real complexity of Tool then centers around its compositions and especially its rhythm section, which from this point on would consist of drummer Danny Carey and new bassist Justin Chancellor. However, AEnima was already half written by the time Chancellor was brought in. As a result, he didn't really have the opportunity to influence it all that much. Plus, he also didn't really feel right in doing so. He was, if you remember, a fan of Tool after all, and didn't feel right especially as the new guy to alter who they were. Justin then would then describe AEnima as having, quote, a real feel of the old band, and I was influenced by that a lot, so I was trying to make it all work with great respect for what they had done before. As such, he wasn't trying to stand out too much, or put too much of his own personal touch on the songs. Instead, he was just trying to make sure it stayed like the Tool he was used to hearing. In some ways, then, AEnima becomes a bit of a showcase for drummer Danny Carey, who was given plenty of opportunities to show off his complex drumming as he provides the backbone for the album. One particularly notable moment in the spotlight comes during the second track, Eulogy, where the rest of the band other than the vocals drop out, creating an especially standout moment for that song. Tool's skill at building to dramatic moments is also on display on the track Push It. Throughout the song about a difficult or even toxic relationship where one partner seems to be always controlling the other, the tension keeps building and building until it climaxes at the end of the song and the presumable end of the relationship. Moments like these are really only possible because of the extended and complex nature of the songs, where even if they do follow a typical verse-chorus structure, they tend to reach a point where the band allows the song to shift gears and go in a different direction and become something else entirely. Meanwhile, in addition to the idea of personal growth and change, the album also provides a bit of social commentary about negative aspects of modern culture that perhaps require their own reckoning and cleaning. Stinkfist, for example, is a commentary on how modern culture through overstimulation creates this feeling of being desensitized, commentary that Maynard cloaks in the metaphor of anal fisting, a choice that is then punctuated by the fact that in the midst of this extended and fairly graphic metaphor, Maynard actually asks, "What's become of subtlety?" In much the same vein as the album's title track, which is a commentary and criticism of the weird and self-obsessed world of LA that they found themselves living in and being both confused and bothered by, which for all of its negativity, much like the album itself, the song is ultimately a call for change and improvement. The song also explicitly references their friend Bill Hicks and his talk about LA falling into the ocean, thereby forming what he termed Arizona Bay. Indeed, they dedicated the album itself to Bill, who had died from pancreatic cancer 2 years earlier. Plus, they would also use a snippet of his War on Drugs monologue for the start of the final track on the album. An odd and experimental track that can at times feel quite unfocused, but is also very interesting. Indeed, there are times where it feels like it hints at the direction they were going on their next album, Lateralus. Although I would argue that album, for all its own expansive nature, is far more focused than Third Eye. Now, some have suggested that AEnima and the overall direction the band took from this point on was a purposeful attempt to weed out the more frat boy and violent mosh pit section of the audience that might have latched onto their initial outings, with the idea being that such individuals would either be driven out or forced to change and grow as a result of these more purposely challenging songs. That being said, it seems more likely this was just a natural growth for the band. According to drummer Danny Carey, for example, quote, "Before AEnima, we were just following our gut. There was a lot of anger in the air, and we never tried to control that. But just as we mature as humans with AEnima, we tried to be fueled more by spiritual ideas, or more of a conscious mode of aiming things in the right place, or trying to take more responsibility for our art." The band then was trying to move past that initial anger that had fueled so much of their earlier music, which again fits into the overall theme of the album of cleaning all the negative shit out of your soul so you can grow and become better. Indeed, Maynard has characterized the initial Tool recordings as being an almost primal scream of sorts. They were just him and the others trying to work some issues out so they could move on. In doing so, though, Maynard could not truly move on, as he then had to perform those songs night after night. So, quote, "Right around the time of AEnima, I was trying to figure out a way to transmute that stuff and let it go, finding different paths to disintegrate that negativity. I did a lot of esoteric, spiritual, and religious research. I read a lot of mathematical and psychological books, and just did a lot of introspection and a lot of sound mind, sound body studies. And that stuff helped take the record in a more esoteric, spiritual direction, but of course while still hanging on to some of the emotions and some of the charged feelings." All of which led into the shift in the band's focus from kind of pulling at scabs and focusing on these negative emotions to using the music as a way to heal, move on, and improve. Also potentially influencing this more spiritual kind of direction is that the band was reportedly taking a lot of psychedelics during this time period, a path that Al Jurgensen of Ministry claims responsibility for putting Tool on, albeit accidentally. According to Jorgensen, Tool's psychedelic road started in 1992 during Lollapalooza. You see, Jurgensen had apparently for a time lived with psychologist Timothy Leary, who had seemingly made it kind of his life mission to spread the gospel of psychedelics and LSD in particular. The psychologist then, before Jurgensen went out on tour, gave the musician several bottles of liquid LSD. Jurgensen would then put a couple drops of the drug into the bottle of whiskey that he drank from while performing. Well, one night on the tour after Ministry wrapped up, a couple of guys that he later learned were Paul Diamore and Maynard from Tool ran into Jurgensen as he was coming off the stage. When these two strangers congratulated him on the set, Jurgensen thanked them and without thinking shared with them the half-finished bottle of whiskey he had been drinking from, forgetting as he did so the LSD he'd put in there. The two members of Tool then drank the whiskey, not realizing they were dosing themselves. According to Jurgensen, the subsequent trip kind of freaked them out, as they didn't know the cause, which is why you don't dose people without their knowledge and consent. Jurgensen, though, would claim that Maynard later thanked him for putting him and the band on that course. While all of these factors, the drugs, the growth as individuals, the desire to express something other than anger and move past that kind of negativity, and even the change in the band's lineup explains the shift in the band's direction, they however aren't the only elements that explains the difference between the sound of Undertow and AEnima. You see, even though Undertow had been a pretty huge hit with Sylvia Massey engineering the album, the band still wanted something different. To be precise, Adam Jones heard the kind of production they wanted when he listened to the album First Day by David Sylvian and Robert Fripp. Danny Carey had a similar experience listening to the King Crimson albums Vroom and Thrak, as when they listened to the clarity of the instruments and the dynamics present on those albums, the members of Tool could not help but think how such production would fit and even elevate the music they were coming up with. So they got into contact with David Bottrill, who was responsible for producing those albums, in addition to some world music work, presumably his albums with Peter Gabriel, that Maynard was particularly enamored with as well. Bottrill was a very creative producer and expert at layering his mixes to create a depth of sound. However, he had never really worked on a metal album before, and so when Tool first reached out, he assumed they had the wrong guy. They insisted they had the right guy, so he went and listened to them playing their new music. When they were done, he was impressed and was on board, but was still confused as to why they wanted him. So they explained that they already knew how to get a metal sound and make a metal sounding album. What they wanted to do and what they needed him for was they wanted to make their next album, AEnima, sound unique. They wanted to make something that didn't sound like every other metal record out there, and the results are really apparent when you listen to Undertow and AEnima back to back, like I did when prepping for this episode. You see, while Undertow isn't necessarily your traditional metal album, it has much more of that typical metal darkness and aggression than their subsequent albums would have. Which is not to say there isn't a certain level of darkness or heaviness in every Tool album, it's just that Undertow very much was focused in that direction. The production then kinda fit what they were doing. It was more dark and almost muted in some ways, as when you listen to AEnima after that, there's just much more clarity to that later album as you're able to hear the vocals and the instruments very clearly. AEnima would release on the 17th of September 1996, debuting at number 2 on the Billboard charts as it did so. For all its strangeness, uniqueness, and complexity, AEnima would prove to be massively popular, with the title track winning a Grammy for Best Metal Performance in the album as a whole, eventually going triple platinum. The future of Tool looked bright, however what no one realized at the time was they would soon be entering some pretty choppy and troubled waters. Issues that would lead to delays in writing their follow-up album. Delays that would lead to the creation of a spin-off group of sorts and the eventual creation of my favorite album of theirs, Lateralus. That, however, will have to, for now, remain a story for another time.
Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.